I'd like to move on to the next story that we honor today. It's about war veterans. So in 2013, after a decade of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, the US Army was kicking out more soldiers for minor misconduct than ever before. Many of these troops had combat exposure. Many of them also suffer from traumatic brain injuries and post-traumatic stress, making them more likely to get into trouble. When they do get into trouble, these troops are often not honorably discharged, and as a result are stripped of medical benefits for life. Those who need help the most, therefore, end up also being the least likely to get it. In May 2013, the Colorado Springs Gazette became the first newspaper to report this nationwide surge in discharges. After the longest period of war in American history, the Gazette wrote, more soldiers like Cash Alvaro in this picture are being discharged for misconduct than at any other time. Alvaro joined the Army when he was just 18 and was hit by multiple bomb blasts in Afghanistan when he turned 19. Charged with misconduct, he was refused a medical discharge. Using data obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, the Gazette found out that since 2006, 76,000 soldiers like Alvaro have been kicked out of the Army. Gazette reporter David Phillips spent months interviewing these soldiers. He found them in homeless shelters, hospitals, abandoned trailers, ratty apartments, and jails. He showed how systemic problems with the medical retirement and deployment processes gave the Army the incentive to discharge injured soldiers for misconduct rather than treat their injuries. Sergeant Gerald Jensen in the picture was in a Humvee in Iraq when his vehicle was hit by a roadside bomb. A chunk of metal hit his head, shattering his face and putting him in a coma. After 16 surgeries, he went back to combat and was injured again. He was sent to recover in Fort Carson, but in 2011 was tested positive for amphetamines and threatened with a dishonorable discharge that would have disqualified him from medical benefits for life. Another soldier featured in the series was Sergeant Paul Sassy, who was hit by a roadside bomb in Iraq in 2007 and suffered from traumatic brain injury. He soldiered on through another tour despite shattered memory and concentration, depression, nightmares, and rage. Diagnosed with post-traumatic stress, Army doctors gave him a mix of contraindicated drugs that made him manic. He attacked his wife and the military police who tried to stop him. He was put in jail when he should have been in treatment. Later, his commander encouraged him to resign instead of getting a court-martial. This would have stripped him of benefits for life. Unsurprisingly, the Army fought the Gazette's coverage every step of the way. Local commanders refused to make key officers available. They refused to give information that was public. They urged the paper's parent company to kill the story, saying that the reporting was false and biased. Dave Phillips was threatened by a lieutenant colonel who warned that the Army had sources who knew whom the reporter was talking to, and that he better be careful. This series made impact. The number of soldiers kicked out with other than honorable discharge immediately started to drop. Congress initiated hearings, and a law was passed requiring PTSD and traumatic brain injury screenings before court-martial proceedings. The lives of those profiled by the Gazette also changed. Alvaro was given VA benefits. He is no longer homeless. Sassy was let out of jail and put in a special Army unit for wounded troops, from where he is now medically retired. Assault charges against him are likely to result in a deferred sentence. I'm pleased to introduce Dave Phillips, now with the New York Times, and his editor, the editor of this series, Joanna Bean, who is now editor of the Gazette. David, how did you become so deeply involved with the problems of struggling veterans?
I want to make just a short public service announcement.
Sure.
First, since we're at Columbia. So I was here 12 years ago, and I was intimidated and confused and figured that everybody else here knew way more about what was going on than I did, and that I was likely unable to amount to much. So I'm very surprised to be here, but I mention that just because I'm sure that there's some people in the audience who feel the same way. And I spent most of my year here screwing up, which apparently had some value. So just to say that all sorts of people can do some important work in this if they stick with it.
Thank you for saying that.
So what the question was, how do we learn?
How did you become involved with this whole veteran
Okay,
story?
so Colorado Springs, for those of you who've never visited, is a great place. Is a very heavily military town. It has a huge army base called Fort Carson, which now has about 32,000 active duty troops. So it is one of many things that our paper covers. And over the years, we covered all sorts of aspects about it: homecomings, leaving. And in 2009, we started covering a story about how there was an increased amount of crime at Fort Carson. And we did a big story that was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize that basically showed that the more combat exposure the troops are having, the more likely they are to commit crime, and that the Army wasn't really addressing that, and so we were having a highly elevated rate of murder in town. And so from that, we learned a lot about PTSD and how the Army talks about how it should treat PTSD and does it really treat PTSD. And we became very interested in the idea of the intersection between injury and behavior, whether that be crime or otherwise. And that idea sort of simmered for a couple years until I got a call from a local advocate who said, hey, there's a guy that you have to see at the county jail. He just got brought straight back from Afghanistan. Part of the Army tried to put him into the psychiatric hospital here in town because he has PTSD, and then his commander pulled him out and put him in jail. And I said, well, that's interesting. That is the intersection of behavior and injury. And so I went and sat down with this guy at the jail and let him tell me his story. And his story was essentially that he had deployed to Iraq once and had a pretty lousy tour and had come back with some PTSD and hadn't really addressed it, as many people don't. He had put it aside to do his job and go on with his life. And he deployed again to Afghanistan and noticed that his symptoms were getting worse: sleeplessness, depression, irritability. And he went to the hospital in Afghanistan, essentially. And they put him on a dose of antipsychotic medicine. A low dose, because if they'd put him on a milligram more, they'd have to evacuate him for essentially an injury. He would have been too unstable to keep in combat. So they said, no, you just need this much, and we'll keep you and go back to work. And then a day or two later, he got in an argument with his tent mates and pulled a machine gun on them. Now, clearly, you can't have a guy with a gun acting like that in a combat outpost. So they evacuated him. And at first, they evacuated him medically, and they diagnosed him with post-traumatic stress and also with bipolar disorder, and they put him in a hospital. But when his commander got home, he thought, well, no, this guy, he did something that is wrong. That's a crime, and I'm going to punish him for it. So he pulled him out, put him in the jail to wait to be court-martialed. So I came back and told Joanna all about this great story that really shows this difficult issue between that tension of what is crime that needs to be punished and what's an injury, and how do we as a society deal with it? And she said, interesting story, suss it out. So I went back, a week later to talk to him again, just chase down some details I hadn't gotten. And he was gone. He was no longer in the jail. And I started calling around to see what happened. And he had gotten a very quick discharge, where essentially his company commander had come in and said, hey, good news, we're not going to court-martial you. You sign this paper, and you can just get out today and go home to South Carolina. The guy says, great, signs the paper, he's out of the Army, he's gone. What he doesn't really understand, it's not clear whether they explained it, but obviously they didn't explain it well, is that when he signs the paper, he is resigning from the Army in lieu of court-martial, and in exchange, he will never be able to apply for any VA benefits again. And so he's just gone. He's essentially like shunted off on the rest of us because the Army didn't know how to deal with the problem. And I thought, wow, that's even more interesting. They decided not to deal with this problem. They never decided whether this was an injury or misconduct. They just decided to push it off on society. I wonder how much that's happening. And so that began our process of, like Chris did, finding the people who are affected, sitting down and talking with them, getting their medical records, trying to talk to the experts that push this whole system along to figure out what is the incentive. Because I never believed that people were doing this because they were trying to be cruel to soldiers. You know, institutions, and there was no profit motive. So why? We had to understand what was the systematic shortcomings that were making this happen. And essentially, if you're in charge of a company of 120 soldiers, this injured soldier was a serious liability to you because until the soldier was gone, you couldn't get a replacement. And if you needed to deploy in 6 months to Afghanistan, you needed everybody to be functional and doing their job and in place, or people could realistically die. But you couldn't get him out medically in that time period. In fact, the medical system was so gummed up that it would take 18 months, 2 years maybe, to get this guy out. And until then, you were short. You just had no one in that spot. And so they found other ways to get them out. And they thought that that was the right thing to do. And so that was sort of the dynamic that we uncovered.
But David, it's hard enough to find these people and to get them to talk to you. But, you know, finding the documents, which you did, getting the military to, you know, give you some information. I mean, how difficult was that, and how did you manage to do this story, given, you know, the opacity of the military establishment?
I think in any story like this, you have allies that would know about the story that you're doing, or at least some facet of it, and want to get that information out. You know, whether it's an attorney that knows that you can't win a cold case or something like that. So we knew veterans advocates who had seen this happen over and over, had seen guys kicked out who were showing up at the veterans only food pantry because they can't get any benefits, they can't have a job. They knew about it and could connect us. We were able to find Army defense attorneys who had tried to, keep this from happening and had failed. And they obviously couldn't talk to us publicly because they'd get in trouble, but they certainly handed us a lot of documents. We were able to talk to other people in the Army who were observing this and didn't like it. Because the Army, you know, is literally 1 million people. It is, there are a lot of different viewpoints within it. And so it was just a matter of connecting with the people that could help you along the way with whatever portion of the trail that they knew.
How long did the story take?
We started in December and it published in May. But
and you got your FOIA requests?
There was a lot of proofreading in there. I mean,
yes. And you got your FOIA requests responded to within that time?
Yeah, because they were really simple FOIA requests, and I don't think that they even knew that, like, they shouldn't give it to us. Because I never found any evidence that the Army, like, knew this was going on and thought anything of it.
Right.
At a systemic level.
At like a higher level. So the bummer about FOIA requests is that oftentimes, maybe this is just in the military, but I have a feeling it's across the board, if they don't want to give it to you, they won't, even if they have to. And they'll come up with some excuse so that you can never show that that's happening, but that's the reality.
Joanna, it takes a team to do a big series like this. Can you talk to us, can you explain to us, the process, the planning process and the reporting process and the putting the story together? What did that take?
Well, it started with Dave and me working together in the beginning, and then Dave quickly sucked up our photo intern. As Dave likes to tell the story, he knew our photo intern wanted to do good work and was an intern for a short time and was willing to work all hours or any hours of the day and night. So before long, the two of them were working closely together. And an interesting thing happened during the early stages of this reporting, as it became clear that what Dave had was something great, but still a lot of work to be done. Our newspaper was purchased by a Denver businessman named Philip Anschutz. And so Dave and I are working down this path and Michael Ciaglo, the photographer who took these incredible images and many more that are on Gazette.com if you want to go find them, we're all working along together, and boom, we have new ownership and new bosses. And that was a delicate thing that I thought was my job.
They were freaked out.
To negotiate, to very carefully negotiate this, because we had new ownership and new bosses who were new to town. They were busy meeting the head of the chamber, the mayor, the head of the city council, the head of the commissioners, and all the military installations. And as word got out about what Dave was working on, word got to our ownership that, what's this good-for-nothing Dave up to? New owners of the Gazette, you really should put a stop to that. And we also had a new editor, and again, I thought part of my job was to prepare him for what we were working on and get buy-in from him. So that was an early part of the team, trying to build a team around that. And then, of course, another crucial part was bringing in the copy editors, the page designer, the photo director, the online editor, our social media folks, all of whom we needed to get this done.
Yeah, because our paper is really easy to ignore. Like we had to like.
What is your circulation?
Daily, we're around 60, 70,000.
So we knew it was a bigger story, and like the cool thing, like despite all the like doom and gloom about journalism, is, 10 years ago the Gazette's reach was the daily circulation, and that's just not true anymore. Social media drove this story, and we knew that going in, and like how were we going to try and roll it out to this larger community that we knew would be receptive.
The thing that was a challenge is, of course, we're a daily newspaper and a daily website, and we do not have an investigative copy desk and an investigative photo department and an investigative page design department. These are all folks who work really hard all day long, and then we said, oh, and here's a really great project too, so can you join us on it and work really hard and stay really late and copy edit it after you've put out an entire paper every day. And we couldn't have done it without them, and that part about building the team was really crucial, and it was crucial to do it not too early but not too far down the road either, because we really needed buy-in from everybody, really everybody in the newsroom. We're not that big a newsroom, but everybody knew what we were working on just about toward the end, and were, I would say, really rooting for us.
The package you had lots of multimedia elements, and I'd like to play one because it's particularly interesting, and it's based on maybe why, while I try to get this going, can you give us can you explain what's in this?
Sure, this came fairly
You
late
do.
in the reporting.
Yeah.
So while we were reporting, Paul Sassy, the guy you saw in handcuffs, was sitting in jail. And while we were there, he got assaulted pretty badly in the jail by the guards. And we were able to get the surveillance. Again, we used the open records request laws, and they said no. And so we got it slipped to us by a sympathetic defense attorney. And it was really, for me, it showed that like this discussion we're having is not academic. So this guy was sitting in jail because the Army didn't know what to do with him. And because he's sitting in jail and unstable, he resists the guards and they beat him up. And then they beat him up and they charge him with assaulting the guards. So he's now looking at an additional 20 years on a civilian charge. And so like we immediately got to see this societal consequence that I was talking about of like, if you don't deal with the problem early, you will deal with it in a larger point later. It's not just me like going blah, 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 you better be careful. You can see it happen.
This is the hospital surveillance
This is the jail.
The jail surveillance
Jail.
video.
Yeah, so what's going on is they put him in solitary, and they've been keeping him without charge in solitary confinement for months, which is crazy, but was going on. And they tell him, hey, you need to come out of your solitary cell. And he says, I'm not coming out. So then they essentially say, yes, you are. We're going to make you. And now you're going to see them make him.
He thought he didn't realize where he was, right, Dave?
Yeah, he's
thought he
delusional.
he thought he was still in combat.
Yeah.
So let's play the video.
Is it going to have audio? If not, I can commentate.
hope it will have audio.
In July 2012, Sergeant Paul Sassy was an inmate at the El Paso County Jail. The Iraq War veteran had been diagnosed with TBI and PTSD and thought he was in an Iraqi prison. One day, when Sassy refused to leave his cell, sheriff deputies decided they would remove him by force. They started by spraying pepper spray through a slot at the base of his door. After several sprays of pepper spray, a deputy kicks closed the slot to hold the spray in. A team of officers then comes to extract him from the room, bringing with them a chair to wheel him away on. The sting of the pepper spray is so strong that a medical technician has to turn away and cover her face. Sassy says officers punched and kicked him when they entered his cell. Officers say Sassy punched and kicked them, and he was charged with 3 counts of assault. If convicted, he faces 15 to 48 years in prison. A few minutes later, they drag him from the room in handcuffs. The deputies strap him in a chair, put a muzzle on him, and wheel him away to another cell. Paul Sassy spent the next several months in solitary confinement without charge, developing what one doctor called severe psychiatric disease. As the deputies haul him away, Sassy's blood is left on the jailroom floor.
Please tell us there's a happy ending to this story.
Actually, there's an amazingly happy ending to this story. So after we reported it, they dropped all civilian and military charges to him. He had to essentially plead guilty and get no punishment. It's a deferred sentence where he says, yes, I did this, but they won't punish him. He was let out of jail. He was put in a special medical unit at Fort Carson that gave him very good care. He was medically retired. He got out in fairly recently, late August. And he moved back to Maryland, which is where he's from. He's doing very well. He and I are we keep up on Facebook. So his thing is he just got one of those PTSD service dogs, which is really great. He also got together, I didn't see this coming, he got back together with his wife, who he had seriously assaulted during his PTSD and medicine-induced mania. And they patched things up, and they have 3 kids. So, I mean, it's worked out as well as it possibly could.
Joanna, what are your key takeaways here? I think there's a very good lesson here on how a small newspaper can win a Pulitzer. And what are the key lessons that you've gotten from this? Experience?
I would say first, we didn't do this because we thought we were going to win anything. We did it because we thought it was the right thing to do, especially in our community, which, as Dave pointed out, we have 5 military installations, including a very large Army installation that deploys, in fact, is about to deploy a unit to Africa in the Ebola effort, and is about to deploy to the Middle East regarding the ISIS work that has been talked about. So we thought it was a very, very, very important story to do, not because we thought we could have a run at a prize. And I would say, boy, one of the biggest takeaways is try not to lose your prize-winning journalist to the New York Times. I don't know quite how you do that, but
you offer more money.
I don't know.
Or BuzzFeed.
One of the takeaways has been that to build a team early enough that really believes you can do this. We have wonderful journalists in the newsroom, and the key was to elevate the expectations and all believe that we could all work together and do this. That there was no reason at all that a newspaper our size couldn't do this kind of work. And we never thought that we couldn't. We didn't think it was too big or it was too hard, or we just thought it would take some time, and it did. And I suppose another key takeaway is I wish I'd been a little more patient. Our timeline was not our ownership or our managerial timeline, and we had some frustrations around that. But never do I regret that we pushed as hard as we did. And I really do think it's about building the right team and believing in the work, and that any size newspaper can do this work.
Well, yeah, all the tools that we used are tools that you guys have. You know, we didn't travel particularly. We didn't use, I mean, we used YouTube and like, you know, a free video editing software. It wasn't
Open records
It wasn't
requests,
fancy. Open records
interviews.
requests. You know, the only expensive thing was the time, but like it's just reporting, and it's not even reporting really from like a sense of like really in-depth knowledge. The best thing we had going in is that we didn't know what was going on, you know, and we had this sense of like, are you kidding me? That just seems like so incorrect. How can that possibly be? And how do I learn why this is happening? Which obviously is all of you have, or you wouldn't be here. So these are tools that everybody can use.
Yeah?
I would just add that we really saw this as a story that was very important for our local community, but that we suspected had national implications. And so part of the work for us was developing the national reporting part too, but we thought it was a really important story in our community. I mean, these are veterans who are in our jail, they're in line at the grocery store, they're on the PTA. Our community is full of veterans who are a very important part of our community, and that's how I always looked at it. I always looked at it as our story for our newspaper to do.
Questions from our audience, students? Yes.
Hi. With a story like this, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on a reporter's impulse maybe to downplay the crimes that are committed in order to have your reader focus on your subject's humanity, and then realize that like the effect is much smaller and less sinister than the cause. Thanks.
Good question. You didn't want to become an apologist for guys who were doing bad things. The particular case of, can we go back to Paul Sassy's picture of him in handcuffs?
Yeah.
This guy beat his wife up, and then when the MPs showed up, he beat them up. So how do you balance showing his humanity without downplaying the crimes? One of the things that I knew I wanted to go in with is, we were writing this in 2013, and I think by that point, most of the media thought, like, PTSD, TBI, been there, done that, like, done, you know, like, people in the public as well, like, they saw these acronyms, they're like, yeah, I know what that's about. Okay. So I knew that I had a challenge of, like, how do I make you actually listen to this again? And it was to not get caught up in, like, rote ideas, but to just tell these stories as, this is a guy, and here is what happened to him. And then by the time I get to the point where he's at his house, you know, smashing his wife's head against their Jeep, you will know how he got there. And you will be able to decide, you know, what should be the correct response to this act.
And in fact, that's the language that we used in the story. We never at all wanted to back away from describing exactly what veterans and soldiers had done, because that's not really fair to the reader to back away from that at all. And I'll say too that Dave spent a lot of time making sure that we were zeroed in on what the story was. This wasn't about every veteran, or this wasn't about veterans who had other kinds of issues, or we were very careful about narrowing the focus on what exactly the story was that we wanted to tell. So there were other types of stories that Dave put aside and that we didn't report on, that weren't in the band of what we were trying to do, which was veterans who had multiple tours, they weren't in other kinds of trouble, they committed crimes, they were facing other than honorable discharges, and they would lose their benefits for life. So for example, this wasn't a soldier who served in kitchen duty and then came back and beat his wife up. These were combat veterans.
We'll take one more question. Yes.
Hi, first off, thanks for your intro comment about your time as a student here. My question was, I know you mentioned your circulation is much smaller than more national newspapers that have a couple more Pulitzers to their names. And I know some reporters at some of the bigger name papers can spend like a year on one story and don't have to worry about reporting on other stories because they're allocated those resources. And I was wondering how you were able to balance this in-depth piece with your regular duties, or how much, yeah.
You want to answer that, or should I?
You can talk about it from a reporter, and I'll talk
Okay.
about it as the editor.
So the short answer is that Joanna is a great person.
Thank you, Dave.
I didn't do a whole lot else, and I think that worked just because she knew that I was busting my ass and bringing in good stuff, and like she kind of wanted to see it all come together. You know, if I was sitting around, you know, like dragging my heels on a story that wasn't all that good and didn't deserve the resources I was giving it, I think that she'd be like, okay, I also need you to do this and this, and that happened later, but it didn't happen at that time.
I'll say for the rest of us, we had day jobs to do, and this was very much a labor of love that happened largely outside the office, because I had many other duties that were legitimate duties. So, you know, to have a reporter who can do this almost full time was a decision we made, and but I don't want to downplay the role that everybody else played, because they did it, you know, as a labor of love. Like I said, we had copy editors who got the paper out every day, and then they stayed till the middle of the night copy editing this.
Thank you.
Thank you. We can have more questions later after our last panel. So.